A short while ago, a commentator in one of my videos, a fellow called George, did ask me to do a video on how the media have influenced Brexit negotiations. So my thanks to George for asking a very interesting question. This is a really big and complicated topic. But I thought I'd give it a little bit of a quick stab in this video. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. One, because I need to think about it a bit more. But second, because I'm not a specialist in this area, I'm not a behavioural scientist or anything like that. So in trying to answer this question, there's a whole load of very technical areas to go into, which I'm not qualified for. But what I do want to do is talk about this area in negotiation sense. And this has been very much highlighted with a lot of the behaviours and activities that surround Brexit. And it's influential. The media are influential. The media have very unusually shaped an international negotiation. Normally they don't. Normally they just comment on it. But in this particular case, I think there is a good argument to be made in that where we are with Brexit today is because of how the media have influenced people and influenced the way they think. And of course, whatever else we say about politicians, in today politicians want people to support them. So they will either shape their thinking or respond to the way the public thinks. So I thought we'd delve into this strange area. So the first thing really to ask is, what do you believe in the context of Brexit? Now, I know many people watching videos like this, they think Brexit is a total disaster. And in some ways, it doesn't really matter whether you voted for Brexit or not. It doesn't take too much evidence gathering to see that Brexit has gone very badly on a number of fronts. But not everyone believes that. Some people do believe that Brexit is actually going very well. So we need to ask ourselves why. Why do they believe that? Well, of course, this then puts us into a conversation area about cognitive bias. And I imagine many people sort of saying, you can look at Brexit and say, why would anyone think this is anything other than a total disaster? Why do people not see that? Well, when looking at it, the whole cognitive bias thing, and again, do bear in mind I'm not an expert on this. This is me explaining it best I can. The way the brain works, the brain doesn't focus on logic, first of all. The brain is not comfortable with dealing with logic. So when the brain tries to process information, the brain will usually focus on what is emotionally salient, I believe is a phrase a psychologist might use. So what that means is the brain will respond to what creates emotion. That could be fear, that could be anger, that could be joy. And so for Brexit to have created strong emotions, you've got to make people fearful or angry, perhaps. And that's why you'll see a lot of media reporting on Brexit on either side of the fence to use very emotive words. And this is well known in political circles. Trump famously, did say that the truth does not matter. And unfortunately, in many cases, he's correct. What matters is how you make people feel. So think of what Trump used to use, make America great again. There is no logic behind that phrase whatsoever. It is an emotional stimuli. People want to feel great. They want to feel respected. They want to feel on top of the world. That was the messaging. That was the emotional connection. And that was the cognitive bias that Trump was tapping into. And Brexit had been absolutely no different. Listen to the wordings used by politicians. They would talk about opportunities and greatness and freedom, sovereignty, taking back control. These are all emotionally charged phrases, and deliberately so, because they trigger emotional responses in the brain. That is what they're intended to do. So when it comes to understanding cognitive bias, that's how you influence people in many ways. You influence them by triggering an emotional reaction. Now, of course, you should be trying to trigger a positive emotional reaction, but in certain scenarios, negative emotional reaction can be just as powerful. So that's something that you always have to be conscious of in any kind of negotiation. And Brexit have triggered an awful lot of positive stroke negative sort of reactions from various people right from the very beginning, and continues to do so to this day. And those emotions are exploited by the media, for clickbait, for pushing forward certain arguments that confirm what people already believe. So I'll come back to that in a bit. What I want to head on to next, though, are assumptions. Because everyone has to make assumptions to get on with your, average day. You assume your car is going to work, when you plan to drive to work, for example. You make certain assumptions about the weather, that there isn't going to be an earthquake today, all those sorts of things. And negotiations are no different, or how people even view policy proposals are no different. They will make certain assumptions. Now, a lot of those assumptions can be geared by experience, but also those assumptions can be geared by what you've been conditioned to believe. So in a stereotypical sense, if you are on the right side of the political spectrum, you are conditioned to believe that less government is good, for example. And on the left side, more state intervention is good in order to ensure, fairness or equality, for example. So whenever someone proposes something to you, you will look at that proposal possibly with those assumptions in mind, with those biases pre-baked in, based on experience, based on ideology, whatever it may be. And Brexit tapped into that for many people, particularly the assumption that a huge organisation like the EU would be inefficient, ineffective, bureaucratic, all those sorts of phrases, because people will approach things in certain assumptions. They will believe that government, possibly even based by experience, they may believe that their experience with UK government departments is such that all government departments are incompetent. And by sheer extension, so is the EU. So what they've done is generalised. They've lumped everything into one assumption, or to one presumption, perhaps. And that can be quite fatal in any negotiation context. People will always get tripped up by making assumptions. And we saw this very obviously with the UK negotiation team strategy when negotiating Brexit, particularly by David Davis. Oh, the EU will cave in, the German car makers will be banging on Merkel's door, all those sort of things. Those are assumptions expressed by the likes of David Davis based upon his biases. Simple as that, really. And that drove his negotiation strategy, which is one of the key things I teach people not to do. But he did that, he expressed it, and he wasn't challenged on it properly. So he carried on making those assumptions, and he carried on developing his negotiation strategy based upon that. And I'm picking on David Davis just because it's obvious. The truth of the matter is that all of them did that. All the politicians negotiating Brexit made those sorts of assumptions. Possibly exception might be the likes of Theresa May, who tried to go a bit beyond that. Possibly also even Lord Frost maybe tried to go slightly beyond that. But then he might make certain other different, more calculated assumptions. But I don't want to cover that in this video. The final thing I also want to talk about is confirmation bias, or echo chambers. So everyone will be familiar with these concepts. You know that obviously you listen to what you like to listen to. It confirms your beliefs. So you're obviously listening to me, and I'm confirming your belief that Brexit was a complete and utter mess. done very badly, but you had that belief anyway. I did not instill that in you. So when it comes to how people approach Brexit negotiations, what would have happened if they would have been egged on by their peers? So those who strongly favoured Brexit would have been egged on by other Brexiteer supporters. Yes, you should stay the course. Yes, you should see this deal as being a great thing, or you need to challenge back the EU. We have the power. All based upon that echo chamber like scenario. They were having what they proposed validated by people who agreed with them. And this is an important point I always like to make to negotiations, is that it's very easy for inexperienced negotiators to try ignore what people tell them because it doesn't fit what they want to believe. And that doesn't mean you have to accept everything that people tell you, whether you believe in it or not. But it does mean you need to check, you need to validate it, not just assume that it works for you because that is what you want to hear. So that is another of the many mistakes made during the Brexit negotiations, is that the top level negotiators kept believing what they wanted to hear, whether that was from their supporters, whether that was from the media. And that again drove their strategy, drove how they were going to proceed forward in terms of the influences on the negotiations. So let's dig deeper into this, into the role of the media in terms of Brexit. In previous videos, I've talked about the massive failures of stakeholder management. And certainly in a political sense, that was obvious. Theresa May totally failed to manage her stakeholders in Parliament, and all the regional governments and so on. So as a consequence, Parliament rebelled against her, would not accept her withdrawal agreement. And Boris had the exact same problem when he came in. They would not accept his support. But perhaps what I'm overlooking or oversimplifying when I talk about that is that there's another key group of stakeholders, and that is the 52% who voted for Brexit in a referendum. And I'm simplifying here, so please do bear with me. But they are an important stakeholder, because at the end of the day, Boris did go to a general election. He did promise to deliver Brexit, and the validity of his promise, not what we're going to talk about, and those people gave him their vote. He secured their buy-in to proceed. Flawed the concept as it was, or what he was proposing to do, he still secured their buy-in. Now, he was able to do that because it resonated with people. And here's where we talk about the concept of cognitive fluency. Now, again, don't go with me as an expert in this area. I am not. So do your own research, look up cognitive fluency, read papers by people who are proper experts in this field. But what cognitive fluency is about is the way your brain accepts things. So your brain will accept information because it is presented in a way that's comfortable to that brain. Get Brexit done. A very simple phrase, and it resonated with the electorate. Of course, it marks a whole host of illogical assumptions and biases underneath it, but as a very simple message that could be easily understood by people going to cast their vote, it was exceedingly effective. And that because it tapped into this whole cognitive fluency thing, got into the brain. Yeah, get the job done, move on, do other things. Whatever, the thought process that went into that. So the media promoted that. They promoted that particular message. And unfortunately, this is where Go's infamous comment that people are sick and tired of experts was also true. Because all the experts said, well, you can't get Brexit done. That's just impossible. There's just too much to do. It's not to say you can't get Brexit done ever. Of course you can get Brexit done eventually. but you can't get it done within the lifetime of this one parliament, within the period that was promised by Boris Johnson. No one has ever done that sort of thing before, and no logical, sane person would think that. And truthfully, I think even the electorate who voted for that slogan knew that. But it was still a seductive message. It still resonated in the brain. It was something that the brain was comfortable with as a concept. So that was one key aspect of what the media did to continue to generate support for Brexit. Another aspect it called the illusionary truth effect. And again, please do look this up for yourself. This is quite interesting, actually. It's well worth a good read on this. So in terms of the illusionary truth effect, this is all about repetition. Now, you may have seen, of course, with PR, with political messaging, so when I say PR, I do mean press releases and so on. Political messaging, they keep repeating things over and over and over again. It's so damn boring. But you see, that taps into this illusionary truth effect. And it's a peculiar thing in the brain. So I could say to you, Brexit is great. And your brain perhaps automatically going to say, bugger off, no way, don't believe you. And I could say Brexit is great another 10 times, and your brain's still going to say, go away, not interested. But over time, that weakens. That is the way the brain works. It's that when it gets familiar with a concept, it becomes accepted as a normal. Now, something as painfully obvious as Brexit is great is obviously it's too jarring, perhaps. It's not a great example. But there are far more subtle things, other little ways of really making that sort of messaging work. So, we can negotiate trade deals. Or the Northern Ireland Protocol is a problem. First time round, your brain may say, no, that's not true. But by the time you've heard it for the 20th, 30th, however many times, your brain just accepts it. It's almost become a new truth. And that is a lot of what politicians do. They repeat things deliberately because over time, that breaks down people's will to resist that messaging. And this was done an awful lot in the years running up to Brexit and then since Brexit. So you'll see, for example, Lord Frost will talk about Northern Ireland constantly being a problem. He just repeats it. He doesn't provide any logic or evidence that supports it. He just repeats that message. And so, lo and behold, a whole bunch of people think the Northern Ireland Protocol is a problem. Whereas perhaps someone else may came into it without that messaging and just read the Northern Ireland Protocol and say, there's no problem here. What are you talking about? Has everyone gone mad? Why does everyone believe this is a problem when there actually isn't a problem? I oversimplify. I'm not at all trying to dismiss the political problems in Northern Ireland. But I'm using that as an example of how messaging like that, repeating certain phrases, creates their own truth. And this has been done an awful lot in the Brexit campaign on a whole host of matters. So let's take another example, and this is very relevant to generating support for Brexit and in the context of the recent, migrant/refugee crisis. For many years, the newspaper, the media, has been saying immigration is a problem in the UK. Now, I know this is a political topic, and people may agree or disagree with me, but bear with me with this as a concept. So let's say you are someone, living somewhere, a quiet little town somewhere, not a high immigration population, far from it. But every day, you pick up your newspaper and you read, immigration is a problem. And even though you don't even see any immigrants where you live, you start to believe it is. Why? Because it's there every single day. You then see it on the news. Maybe Nigel Farage did this an awful lot. Yes, immigration is a massive problem. We must combat it. We must deal with it. We must take back control. And then you saw it in Facebook, other messaging and Facebook and all the other bits and pieces. So this is one of the huge problems with Brexit. There were people who wanted immigration to be a problem because they were die-hard racists, for example. So that was convenient messaging for them. They believed it anyway. But there's also a very large minority of people who never even thought immigration was a problem until it was thrust into their faces and repeatedly drilled into their brain over a period of many years. So they started to believe it. And then they started to believe the next bit of messaging, that Brexit would tackle that problem. But they still live in that same little town, barely any immigrants at all, there's certainly no overwhelming services or nothing, anything like that. But they now believe that Brexit is a solution to immigration, for example, even though, strictly speaking, immigration had no technical connection to Brexit whatsoever. And this is where we're starting to blend from the illusionary truth effect into things like salient exemplars. Now again, this is another phrase I encourage you to look up. The best example I can think of to explain what a salient exemplar is something that Trump did. And over in the US, Trump described Mexican immigrants as murderers and rapists. Committed all the crime type thing. Terrible, well, horrible messaging, but extremely good example of this concept of salient exemplar. He took immigration, he took crime, and he took skin colour, whatever phrase you want to use, and he put it all together into one connected message. So what a lot of messaging will do is try and connect things for you, to connect with the brain of, oh yes, 2 plus 2 is 4, sort of thing. That's kind of what salient exemplar is. Of course, the 2 may be completely irrelevant. There may be 2 apples and 2 pears. Don't equal 4 apples or 4 pears, do they? That sort of scenario. But an oversimplification of 2 plus 2 still makes 4. So there's a sort of hidden, obvious type truth, but actually isn't true at all. So, for example, going more toward Brexit and the current refugee crisis, Priti Patel has been claiming that many of the refugees coming over in the boats are economic migrants. Yet the actual statistical data by those who drilled into it has established that at least 70% of those coming on the boat actually succeed in their initial refugee application, with a further 59% of those initially rejected successful on appeal. So when you really think about it, that means that in any given boat coming across the channel, possibly less than 10% of that boat, or the people on that boat, could be considered as economic migrants. But the salient exemplar is that all these people are coming over to the UK to steal our jobs, to take advantage of our welfare, not that they're fleeing war-torn zones or whatever. And that is deliberate messaging done by the likes of Priti Patel. She's nowhere near as good as Trump was at it, but that is what she is trying to do, and that is what Trump did as part of his electioneering. And he was recognised as being extremely effective in that. And this government has been trying to do the same. So now there's a final point I want to leave here. And I've been trying to give you a coherent narrative of what is going on and how Brexit has been influencing you and how influencing those who believe in it. But something I always caution people, and it's not just to do with Brexit, but to do with absolutely anything to do with public or government policy. There is no such thing as clear-cut argument in government policy. If doing something was clearly the right thing to do, with no consequences, with no trade-offs, then in all odds, the government would already be doing it, if there are clear benefits. So everything where there's an argument, there's an element of grey, there's an element of uncertainty. So one of the things you always have to be wary of is any messaging from the media that clearly says this is the right thing to do. Because nothing is ever that clear-cut and dried. It's just oversimplifying the message. And it's oversimplifying the message deliberately to make it easier for your brain to process it. This is an important point. anything that happened, even refugees, migrants, negotiations, Northern Ireland Protocol, anything like that, it is complicated. And there is no answer that is so 100% correct that there can be no alternative. There is always an argument on either side of the coin. And it's worth acknowledging that, and then acknowledging that you've absorbed all the information that you can, and that you're making a judgment that falls on one or the other side of that argument. And this is one of the key criticisms I would have of the British media. It doesn't explain complexity. It doesn't seek to inform people how difficult it is to actually make a decision. And anything like Brexit is a difficult decision. Implementing that decision is incredibly difficult. And I think part of the whole problem is that this desire, a constant need to oversimplify the message so people can understand it, hides the complexity. Because at the end of the day, if you really wanted Brexit to succeed, you would have to know that it is a long-term plan, and you have to persuade people that they have to stay the course for the long term for it to succeed. But that is not the messaging that has been put out for so many years. You saw quick wins, quick and easy, when obviously the truth is it's anything but. So this perhaps nicely leads me to my next point, which how does a negotiator, a typical person such as myself, defend myself against bias? I mean, I've got bias just as much as anybody else has. So what sort of things would I do to avoid being unduly influenced with any type of negotiation? Well, for a start, there's removal of emotion. When it comes to doing big, complicated negotiations, we're trying to operate on the logic side of the brain, not the emotional side of the brain. And the truth is, that is extremely tiring. It's exhausting trying to make the brain operate that way. But that is what you have to do. Now, did the likes of David Davis or any other failed negotiators, whether it's Lord Frost or Dominic Raab, did they try to apply logic when sitting opposite at the EU and during the negotiations? I'm sure they did. But I'm sure they found it tiring, and when they found it tiring, they probably just slipped back to emotional phrases, perhaps even some cliched stuff. I don't know, I wasn't in the room. But that's my speculative guess, that they didn't keep emotions out of it, certainly in terms of their thinking. And that's something you should always do in any negotiation, tiring as it is. Another defense against these sorts of problems is extensive preparation and knowledge. The more you know, the more you understand, the better you can avoid being swayed by spurious, silly, emotional types of arguments. And that's pretty much true for anything really, not anything unique to negotiation. Another trick that I find very helpful is arguing both sides. Try and put a counter-argument even to your own viewpoint. And you do that for two reasons, not only to eliminate bias, which is one, but also to try and identify the attack angles that the other side may use so that you can counter them. So if you can figure out how they may see things, what sort of arguments they may put forward, then as part of your preparation, you can prepare your counter arguments, you can prepare how to rebut their suggestions. And it's helpful. Sometimes you may even be slightly swayed by saying, you know what, I think they've got a point here, actually. This is an issue that we should address. And so when they raise an objection, you've then got a viable answer. You thought ahead. So arguing both sides is a very useful thing to do as part of any negotiation preparation. Definitely wasn't done in Brexit. I mean, it was just argued one side, the UK side, whatever it is. I doubt very much they looked at it from, what's for the EU in this. I think the EU did do that for the UK side, but I think the EU found that extraordinarily difficult because the messaging from the UK side was so incoherent. It was hard for them to try and argue both sides. And that is how the EU will operate at negotiations. The European method of negotiation, I'm comparing European to American here, which is a simplification, but it is broadly true. But European negotiation is all about building consensus. It's based on the politics, legal systems, how they operate. So by building consensus, you have to understand the argument of the other side. Slightly more the American stroke adversarial style of negotiation is you don't care. You've got your position, you've got what you want, and who cares what the other side wants, sort of thing. It's a bit more aggressive, if you like. So I've no doubt that the EU would have tried to argue both sides when trying to negotiate Brexit as part of the planning process. But they probably would have found it very difficult. Something else I will also teach a lot is process. And the negotiation process is deliberately designed to strip out emotion, to strip out biases. So if you've got, because a process doesn't care about emotion or how well argued a point may be. So if you've got a really good process where you prepare well, you've got to consult a whole range of people in your organization, you then go and negotiate, you then come back and you have to present the results of that negotiation to that entire organization. Well, not the entire organization, but all the relevant people that have a say. To the lawyers, for example, or the engineers, or the project managers, whoever it may be, they're all experts in their field. And if they're all part of the process, they will look at what you have done as critical observers. That's part of the process, is having critical observers who haven't been swayed by someone who perhaps pulled the wool over your eyes. They're there to set you straight, to say, well, actually, you may have thought you were agreeing to this, but really you've undermined your position slightly. So that is all part of the how you improve yourself at a negotiation and how you would defend yourself against emotion and bias. And again, none of this was followed, not in any adequate way, when it came to Brexit negotiations. Not least because the people implementing it, not just the politicians, but also the civil servant, they weren't that experienced negotiators. The Department of International Trade was a brand new department, and they just roped in people from all sorts of places, probably very few of which were experienced professional negotiators, especially at government/EU level. So they didn't do this. They didn't have this well-established process. And that would have been a massive reason why they failed to spot things like Northern Ireland Protocol failures or copy and paste job errors and so on and so forth. They just didn't have that process. So let's end this a little bit, because this is a long video and I hope you found this interesting despite how long I've gone into this topic. I did say we're going to try not to get into too long. But you may be looking at all of that what I just said and you may think, no, that couldn't happen to me. I'm too intelligent for that. I'm too well informed for that. Well, the truth of the matter is no one is immune from this sort of influence. Yes, Brexit stuff may seem a bit obvious and clumsy to people who like to delve a little bit deeper into things. But at the end of the day, we are all influenced by positive and negative influences. Any people we speak to, any information that we gather, whether through conversation, whether through reading, whether through watching videos, that all influences us in small and subtle ways. Remember what I said about the person living in a small town who thinks immigration is a problem, even though they've hardly ever even seen an immigrant. They can be influenced that way, and so can you. Not so obviously, perhaps, but certainly in some other ways. You can be influenced by people who know how to do it. The government, or the Conservative Party I should probably say, or the Leave campaign, paid a company called Cambridge Analytics millions of pounds. Cambridge Analytics scraped out a whole load of data from Facebook data and used it in order to shape people's thinking. They were incredibly effective at doing so. They boasted about influencing elections. So all those little things, all those little dark arts that they use, they do work. And they work possibly because you're not the target. Your resistance to Brexit may be very strongly embedded. Fine, that's it. You'll never change your position maybe, or your argument for Brexit may be very strongly embedded, and nothing will shift you off it. Fine. But this messaging is not aimed at you. or what the media had done to influence negotiations and support for Brexit. That messaging is aimed at the rest of the population who is more amenable to suggestion, who are more willing to change their minds. Because remember, this is a numbers game. We, and I'm talking about we as those watching these YouTube videos on this sort of subject matter, we have certain ways of thinking. We want to go deeper. We also perhaps have a certain higher level of resistance to bland statement assertions, to people repeating things. Certainly for me, that triggers alarm bells. From my experience, I always get suspicious when someone starts repeating things at me. I've seen too much political messaging. But there's lots of other people who do not have that experience and do not have that sort of inbuilt sense of danger or survival. And they can be a significant number in any given population. So this is why I talk about the tower of 2%. All that cognitive bias, all that messaging, it may seem obvious, clunky, and clumsy to you. But if it works on just 2% of the UK population, that amounts to roughly 1.2 to 1.3 million people. Now, bearing in mind that we live in a first past the post political system, where the two main parties, Conservatives and Labour, have very strong tribal supporters. People will be lifelong Conservative supporters, they'll be lifelong Labour supporters. Nothing will shift them off their position. They may be unhappy with their party and choose not to turn up and vote at a given election, but they will never really shift to vote for the other side. They will always vote only their own side. But if you can grab a 2% swing vote and shift them your way and keep them there forever, that's 1.2, 1.3 million people. That is enough to make you win an election. It's enough to make you win a referendum. That is all it takes, is using these sorts of biases, using this sort of messaging to shift those people who don't understand what it is that you may be doing. And that is the power of the media. That is how they're able to influence the Brexit negotiations, because even that 2% of the population is what those pushing heavily forward the Brexit project depend upon. That 2% can keep them in power. Losing that 2% can lose them power. And it's as simple as that in some ways. It's a numbers game. And you keep putting out the messages to as many people as possible to get that numbers and to keep yourself in power. So I hope you found this video interesting. Sorry it was a bit long and complicated. But yeah, if you do like it, please do hit the like button and comment in the comment section below.